Hey guys. So today we're going to go through a game between Jason Lee and Joey Mallick. This was late in the 2014 National Scrabble Championship. Both players are fairly under the radar, but they're very good players. Both tend to be a little bit more defensive than normal, I think, although this doesn't end up being too defensive of a game. This was a very large turning point in the 2014 National Scrabble Championship. The winner of this will be playing for the title in the next round. So this was the penultimate round of the championship. Jason goes first, DIOTTV blank, and he plays divot. I think you can make a case for actually playing this off-center a little bit. This is one of the few circumstances where it may actually be worthwhile, but I think that this is definitely the standard position, and I think it's perfectly fine to play here as well. Joey, CEEOTUY, and really two options. He can play U or he can play Covey. I think it's pretty close. The Covey leave is a little bit better for this particular board, but it's just a worse leave in general. CEE is not exactly something that's ideal to keep, but it's not bad either. There's no reason to think that Jason has an R on this spot, so I don't think it really matters very much. I think both plays are fine. Jason, ADEOTT blank, and two choices. He can play Toasted or he can play Tattooed. So the good thing about Tattooed is it leaves less scoring options immediately. It's not really a clear spot to score after Tattooed, whereas after Toasted, there's quite a few scoring spots that you have to worry about. And there's no reason to think that Joey has a particularly strong lead that can bingo next turn, so for that reason, it's perfectly okay to leave all of these bingo lines open as opposed to scoring spots. Joey can easily have high point tiles in his rack, clunky rack, etc., etc. And Tattooed just does a lot better against those sorts of racks. Tattooed does make a right angle, but it's a right angle with an S hook. Divot's going to be hooked, so it's not going to be closing the board that well. So I don't think that positionally it's that big of a difference. I think that it's going to be easy to open the top right no matter what happens here. So I think Tattooed may be a little bit better overall just because it's going to be a little bit easier to close the board after Tattooed, even though you can probably open the top right. There may be things that happen later in the game that enable Jason to close the Divot's hook, and then that's going to make life really difficult. There's also the C in Covey, which makes opening the top right a lot easier, so it's going to be difficult to block that off. But nevertheless, it's still possible to block that quadrant, and thus it's still worth blocking. Just because you can't close the quadrant entirely doesn't mean that blocking isn't worth it. It's still worth something. Yes, it's going to take a little bit of work to block the top right, but you should still at least start the process of doing so. So for that reason, I do prefer Tattooed. Joey's near bingo, ADERTUY. Several options here. There's Oi, there's Deary, there's YA, there's Your, there's You. I think they're all reasonable. I probably prefer OY just because it's what bingos the most often. And even though it's not the best leave statically, the two O's that are open are likely to stay open. And because of that, it's going to be pretty likely that you're going to be able to bingo. O is a huge help. You have outread plus almost anything here. Play YA in either spot, it's going to start closing bingo lines. And even if they're not bingo lines that necessarily are that useful to you, they're bingo lines that serve as a diversion, which is really important here. You don't want your opponent to pick the lines to block, and if they have to choose a multitude of lines to block, they're most likely to block the ED and Tattooed, which is good for you because you have both the D and the E, so those aren't actually lines that are very good for you. You'd much rather they leave open the O's. YA also has the problem that it can be reparalleled. That's a big problem in this case. It may leave you 7 lines, but it's also very likely that he's going to parallel and basically take out most of the lines in Tattooed, and most of your options are actually not going to be very good. And since you don't have an S, you're not going to be able to take advantage of other bingo lines. So, for example, if you make like TAM or something like that, you're not going to be able to hook the S, TAV or TAW, any of those things. Because you don't have the S, then that's actually not a very good line for you, and it's very likely that a lot of your eights lines are going to be blocked. And with this rack, you actually need those eights lines, because that's going to be the majority of times that you're going to bingo with this particular rack. So for that reason, I don't really want to create something that is going to allow your opponent to block better. And that's why I don't like either YA. I think your rack is too strong and you're behind, so you need to actually try to bingo, so I think that Deary and Yor are kind of out. And that leaves OY, which is what Joey plays. Jason, ACDEEFU. He can play feuded or he can play defaced in 2 spots. I definitely prefer defaced where Jason plays it. Again, we're trying to close quadrants. At this point, Joey's also closed the C, which means it's a little bit harder now to access the top right, which means that making the D go downwards so that the D can't access the top left is going to make it very difficult to open the entire top of the board, especially if we can do something to get rid of that Divot's hook. Life could become very difficult for Joey in future turns here if we get to start blocking some of the open 8s in the tattooed spot. Rows 9 to 15 are still open, but those spots could close very rapidly if Joey doesn't have a strong rack. And it's not the easiest lines to hit either, especially if Joey doesn't have a blank or something like that. Defaced also does leave some overlaps, which I think are actually good for Jason. Some of those overlaps can score quite well and even outrun some of the bingos, in theory. And at this point, Jason's definitely looking to close the board. Not now, necessarily. He might have to wait a few turns, he might have to score, and he might have to fade at least one bingo from Joey because it's very likely Joey's going to bingo. But hopefully Jason will still have a lead at that point, and then he'll score, and then he can start blocking. Joey draws a bingo, plays it. I think it's fairly standard. I don't think that you can really consider out trade here. I think you need to take the points, and the D is one of the safer tiles to leave in the triple alley. It's going to be hard to even use that D to score very well, much less bingo. Outtrade and outrated also leave parallel plays that could score a lot of points and make it a lot harder for Joey to open the board or bingo in future turns. So I think that outrated is definitely the play. Even after this bingo, Joey's going to be behind, so he does have to think about lines a little bit, and this is the best way to do it. And this is the best way to score the most points, too, so I think it's pretty clear. Jason draws very badly. 3 U's and a V, which is just a disaster. He can play through this rack, he can play Virtue, but I don't think it's worth it. I think exchanging is fairly standard and fine here. He likes to change 5, I think that's fine. I don't see any reason to not keep the A or the R. I guess the R is a bingo lane, but the R is also just a really good tile. The A goes with it fine, it's a good enough tile to keep for sure. Don't think it's necessary that you need to keep AR, you can just keep R if you want. I think it's pretty borderline and either play is okay. But I definitely prefer exchanging over playing here. Joey with EFI MMOW, and you can either play wife or wifed. I prefer wifed, mostly because of the wifedoms extension. That can be a big deal in future turns. Yes, it is valuable to start closing bingo lines some, because now Joey is in a slightly favorable position, but it's not a very favorable position for sure. It's not really that big of a deal here. Just the extension is just worth a decent amount. It's not worth a ton, but it's worth more than enough. There's still 4 S's left. They'll keep OM on future turns and draw it on a next turn or something like that. I do think there's some definite value there, so I think I prefer wifed. Jason with AAEGIRR, and really just a medley of options here. You can play Gardai, you can play Gator, play Ag, Air, just a medley of spots to score 15 to 20 points, but nothing that really stands out here. Goes with Ag, I think that's fine. You hit some bingos here. You don't hit a lot of bingos. It's not exactly an ideal spot. Even if you hit a bingo, it's not that necessarily likely that it'll play. You don't have an S, so it's going to be somewhat difficult to get bingos down. Joey's range is going to be a lot more scoring heavy, so that's going to make it harder. You're going to be behind after this play now. I probably slightly prefer playing longer, but I think that playing shorter is fine too. Probably would end up playing Gardai, I guess. But I think this is a perfectly fine line. Just a little bit more risky line. And there's nothing wrong with risk, per se. I tend to avoid risk most of the time if I feel like I can outplay somebody, but that doesn't mean that risk is necessarily bad. It just means that you're trying to avoid it because you think you're going to be better at future spots than your opponent. And I think that these plays are roughly equal, and just one play is much riskier than the other. I think AG just is either you bingo or you end up not scoring whatsoever. And I don't tend to like making plays like that too often. If I were farther behind, I might be considering it more. I guess he is behind a little bit, so it's a little bit better to make options and plays like this, but I still don't tend to like doing it too much. If you was maybe, 70 or 80 points behind, it might be more liable to play AG here. But when you're only going to be down 5 after the next play, or 10, depending on what you play, I definitely prefer something that's a little bit less risk-intensive and gives me future options that are a lot better. With AEIRR, your options next turn are going to be not very many. You're going to be basically dictated by your rack what you can do. It's not really a lot of room for flexibility or creativity or picking a better option and making better decisions than your opponent on future turns. Just going to be very limiting. So I think that I prefer something that's a little bit longer here. But again, AG is just fine as well. Joey, AIKMMNO, really only has one option here. He plays Kinema. Interestingly, Kinema still leaves Wipedomes as an overlap. And that may not be obvious immediately, but that just pushes Kinema even more over the top than it already is. Very clear play. It does leave an S-hook that isn't ideal, but we can take care of that later, and it's just so many more points and so much better in terms of leave and scoring than any other play that you just have to make it. AEIRRRW for Jason, and a medley of choices. You can play War, you can play Redrawer or Redware, He can play Wirer or Ryer, or he can play Wira. So I think I prefer Redware over Redrawer. I want to keep the R and I want to keep column J open. And I think I also prefer Wirer over Ryer. I think I'd rather have the I open than the R, especially since I have an R in my rack, and for stuff like IER. War obviously scores the most number of points, but it also gives your opponent a lot of really easy options along column B, and EIRR isn't that great of a leave here, so yes, it does have the best points in equity, and it probably is going to bingo the most often, but I just don't think it's worth it here. Wira does block the board a little bit too much too. Yes, it blocks the Kinemis hook, which is actually really good for you, and you do need to block that probably eventually anyway. But blocking column J and K and blocking the D is not exactly ideal here. Overall, I think I prefer Redware, but I do think it's really close. I think that all the other options are quite reasonable here. And I think on a different day I might play something like Wirer. Jason goes with War. I think it's perfectly understandable as well, but it does involve a lot of easy options along column B. EEGMNOO for Joey, and he plays Genome. Now, you can think about other plays, but I don't really think I could really substantiate any of them. You could play Ego, for example, and maybe keep the Whitethorns extension, but just no. Genome does a very good job of blocking all of that. Genome just scores so many points, gives you so many good options for future turns, blocks that entire side. Just seems easily the best play. You're going to be up by almost a bingo at this point. It seems clear to take the points, at least to me. EHIIIRR for Jason. Not very many good options. You can play Rim or you can play him. I guess you can play Irid as well. He's so far behind at this point. He's 69 points back that even if he does get a bingo, it's not even really going to give him a lead. Rim does bingo more often, but at the same point, no play is really going to bingo all that much. You know, the H is an okay tile. It's a good tile in general, but it's not that great here. Pretty yucky position. I mean, you do need to draw an S now. It's getting pretty dire. A lot of the time, Jason's even going to have to exchange next turn, and that's not going to be good, because then, even if he does bingo, he's still going to be behind. Plays up playing him. I think it's okay. I think Rim is okay, too. Don't think there's that big of a difference between the two. I guess I prefer him by a little bit, just because you can draw some bingos, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. I'm fine with either of those plays at this score. Joey, ABGNOOP, and he plays Goban. I think that's standard. I think you have to do that. You definitely want to play Goban over Bogan because you definitely want to block column B here. Column B could end up being bad news, but it's much harder if you make it so that he has to overlap the G. It's much harder to do that than overlap the B, so that's why he plays Goban. Again, there's S's, there's blanks, and he's going to want to start blocking the board very shortly now. I think that you're in a position now that you can even consider doing something like a boon. I don't think that's crazy. You have overlaps and re-overlaps. You know your opponent doesn't have an X very often. I don't think I would do it yet. I think it's a little bit early to do that, but it's something that you should definitely be considering, even though it's going to be crazy in terms of points and leave. It's certainly worth it because of the positional aspects, but I think you can wait till next turn to do something like that. I don't think you need to do it quite yet. Jason finally draws an S, but it may be too late at this point, and he has really no scoring options. He really would actually like to take out the Kinemis hook, not because he can score a lot with it with something like Rise, but because it's actually really dangerous to leave that open, because if Joey uses it, then he's just going to outscore any bingo that Jason might play. Being said, it's not very easy to do that this turn. So yeah, he has Rid and he has Ire, and not really a lot of options other than Rise. I don't think you can do Rise. I think you're going to be in just too much trouble in terms of bingoing, and yes, it is bad to leave that spot open, but you need to bingo. You need to actually get in the game first. I do prefer Ire. I don't really see the point of playing Grid, to be honest. He is going to have to bingo, though, and he's running out of time. He has to bingo very, very soon. Joey's going to end up closing out that bottom right quadrant, and it's just going to make Jason's life very, very, very difficult. Some players might think about playing Air here, but that would actually be a really bad play because of row 8 plays, which would block the Ski hook, and you're already blocking Divots hook, so you're making the board much more difficult to bingo. Yes, you're creating an S hook that you can put in column K, but you're just giving your opponent too good of options to block, in addition to all the lines that you're already blocking yourself. So yeah, I wouldn't play Air here. I think that Ire or Rid is just much better. Jason goes with Rid. Joey, IIJLNLP, and a very, very strong position. At this point, he has to start thinking about closing the board. He could do something like Jot, and that would be the best play in terms of points and leave, probably, but Jot isn't very good just because it's going to be very difficult to close the board. It doesn't help close the board at all. I think that's very important here. And yes, even though you're going to have a lead, you still would rather he just not bingo at all. You'd much rather close the board and not leave this game to chance. You don't necessarily need to close everything this turn. I think that's a misconception a lot of people get. If you make some play that closes at least some of the lines and lets you close both the S-hook in divots and the S-hook in ski next turn, I think that's plenty good enough. Or you could just close one of them and then threaten closing the other one next turn. Something like Joint does that very well. Blocks the divots hook, threatens to block the ski hook next turn. I think that's a perfectly reasonable option. Even something like a loin. A loin actually blocks both hooks, and yes, it only scores 6 points, but you're still up by over a bingo at that point. You're still keeping a decent lead. I think that's also a very reasonable option. I actually like it a lot. The more that I look at this, the more I like that play. You can use the J to overlap next turn. Just really, really good situation for you. Very hard to hit the O and the I. A little bit easier to hit the N, but still not that easy to hit the N. And Jason's flipped over a good rack. He's shown that he has very good tiles here, so you really want to start doing what you can to minimize bingos. And even though the N's a good tile, it's fairly likely Jason has one, which makes the N opening a lot less good here. So I think I actually probably like a loin here. If not, I prefer doing something like Joint, something that's going to close the board sooner rather than later. Joey does something very weird and plays Jilt. I'm not really sure I understand this play. I don't think it's necessarily bad. It does keep a good leave, it does score some, it does block a little bit, but I think that there are just plays that are a lot better here. I'm not really too concerned with keeping a good leave here. I don't think it's that important. So I definitely prefer some other play like Joint or a loin here. Joey decides to play Jilt, and we move on to Jason's rack. Jason draws the X. I don't think Jason has very many options here. He plays XI. Blocks the S hook, which is pretty good. You don't really want to leave that S because you don't really want to leave scoring spots in the situation. And while you can fish here, you can play something like Lex. You're just giving up too many points. You're even going to be behind after a bingo after Lex. So it's not really that good. Joey just protected the S-hook and divots a little bit. It's going to be really hard to block that now. One of the reasons why I don't particularly like Jilt too much, because you can't block divots and score any points at the same time. So Jason actually kind of has free reign, at least for one turn, in terms of getting a bingo down. Joey's not going to be able to block both lines in the same turn. You can also consider Lax. You're setting up SI, but I think that SI hook is just not very good. It's very, very devastating if Joey gets it, and I don't think that you're even going to want to play it a lot of the time that you get it, because you're going to want to bingo instead. So I don't think that's worth playing Lax. I think that you just drop XI, hope to draw a vowel, and then hope to bingo. Joey, EINOOPT, and a few options here. He can play Potion or Option. He can play Lop. I definitely prefer Potion here, and over Option, and over Lop. Lop doesn't open any new lanes, and that's kind of the benefit of it, and I get that. And it's very clear that Jason's near bingo, so I get that you don't want to open immediate lanes for Jason, and that those plays do that. But they also score more points, and they also allow you to block all the rest of the lines next turn. If you play Potion instead of Option, you leave the O at 6k, and that's actually a benefit for you because you get to play 6J plays that go across and just block everything at the same time. And there's very little that Jason can actually do about it. And I think that's a huge benefit to you. Jason would have to open up something on the left side of the board somewhere or some other bingo line, which is actually very difficult to do in this spot. So I think that Potions, even though it gives away a few more bingos next turn, it makes it much easier on future turns to start blocking the board, which again I think is very important. Yes, EINOT does bingo yourself some of the time. Yes, there are 4 S's left that you can use to bingo. Yes, column B is good for TION bingos, and yes, you'll get numerous shots at it, but I think it's still much more important to think about blocking and not about bingoing yourself here. You have a lead. It's not worth it just to try and outrun bingos. Sometimes you need to play defense and you need to try to get in situations where you can just win the game much easier by not even getting to the point where, Jason bingos and you have to try to outrun him a little bit. It's much better just to try and end it as soon as possible. And I think that Potion does a much better job. Even better than Option. I really think that you need to play Potion here and then hope to draw something through the O and just block everything next turn. I think that's really your best hope of winning this game. Joey does play Lop. Again, I understand you're giving fewer things away. If he does bingo, you have a much better shot at bingoing yourself. So it does feel like a bit of a free roll, but still prefer a Potion here. Jason, ELLRSSU, and a few options. He can play Tills, he can play Till, he can play Till with 1 L. You can also play just the S off. I definitely prefer Till. I think it's the best bingo line here. really what you want to do is you want to try to go through the bag and figure out which play is going to bingo the most often. And even though the S is duplicated, it's still better to duplicate an S than to keep an L. Rules is a much worse lead than users is, especially with this pool. And the S has more potential on future turns if you need to fish again. It's much easier to play off the S than it is going to be to play off the L next turn. So I think tail's a little bit better. I think this is okay as well. The one-tile plays, you want to look in the bag and you want to see how many times each of those plays hit. And in this case, it's not very often. ELR SSU doesn't hit very often in this pool, and ELL RSU doesn't hit very often either. So for that reason, I do prefer till, keeping ERSSU. I think that's the best play. Joey, EEINOPT. And again, he's faced with a very similar scenario as last turn. You can play Joe, and you can play Pinto. I think those are his two best plays. Joe does block the S, but there's still the divots hook, which, again, isn't even really possible to block without an S yourself. Joey's not going to be able to block it next turn very often at all. And you are leaving the E open for bingos as well, which isn't ideal. Pinto, yes, it does leave QI, but there's almost no chance that Jason has QI at this point. It's not even very likely he has the last I, much less the Q at this point, so I don't think that's that big of a threat. I think it's actually a bigger threat that you have it. He never has QU, so you can draw QU. And again, he gets to play through the I and block both bingo lines, and that's very, very useful at this score. And he doesn't leave so many lanes open. The P and the I and the are going to be very difficult to use it for 8s, and it's going to be pretty hard to parallel Pinto and bingo. It is possible, but it's going to be pretty difficult. And it just creates a much better scoring dynamic for you, so I think that's definitely something that's worth considering. There is the thing that some of the time Jason's going to have a U as well, and he's going to play SUQ, and that's something that is a drawback to Pinto as well. Because if that's the case, then Jason is even going to need to bingo. I don't know, I think it's pretty close here. I don't really think there's a huge difference between the options. Joey plays Joe, I think it's fine. Not too big of a fan of how he got in this position anyway. He's just going to have to let Jason bingo with divots and then move on. That's probably what's going to be happening. If there were some other play besides Pinto that was longer, even a 3-tile play that ended in O, I think that would be much preferable. But there just isn't. He has to give up things like SUQ, and that's not ideal. And because that's a really tough position, I think it's going to be really hard to find anything that's all that satisfactory. Jason bingos, plays reusable to the E and Joe, and all of a sudden we have a game now. Joey, EILNNPT. Now, he has a few options. He can play 10-pin, he can play nip, or he can play nil. All of them block roughly the same options. 10-pin does block the R, but the R is not really a very good lane given this pool. There are some key tiles out. There's 2 U's for the Q that's out, and there's the Z, and there's the blank. Other than that, not a heck of a lot going on. Bingo is going to be pretty difficult given this pool. If either player has a rack that bingos, the game's over anyway, regardless of whether they get a bingo down or not. So even though there are 2 U's, the Q's still a really bad tile here because the Q's really inflexible. It's really hard to play it. I guess there's stuff like Kirsch, but it's going to be pretty rare for actually the Q to be a good scoring tile here. That being said, it is worth something to block the R. I think I prefer 10-pin here. It scores the most points. It gives you the most shots at the blank. It gives you some shots at like the H. Make sure that if you draw the Q, you probably have a U at least to back it up a little bit. Even though QU is still not very good, you're going to have a lead. And it does get some tiles out of the bag so that bingoing is a little bit more difficult, or fishing for a bingo is a little bit more difficult. I think it's just a slightly better play, mostly because of the points, and mostly because of the endgame timing, which is definitely preferable here. Joey plays nil. I don't think that ELNT or ENPT are really good leaves here. Yes, they are good bingo leaves, and yes, if you draw an S and you draw either the A, the I, or the O, they're pretty good, but that's not going to happen most of the time. And there's a decent chance that even that line gets blocked anyway, because a lot of players are going to play through the R, even though they're not going to score that many points while doing so. So yeah, I think 10-pin's just better. I think you really need to try and hit the blank, or you need to try to hit the Z and hit some sort of good scoring option. I think that nil just doesn't score enough. It lets Jason outrun just far too often. Jason, ANQRRZ blank. So he draws all the scoring tiles and the blank. Pool's pretty balanced. The R is not going to be very good for Jason because he has 2 of them already, and he has the Q and the Z. But on the other hand, given this pool, it's actually a pretty good threat for Joey, especially since he left it open, so it makes it more likely that Joey has tiles that play well through the R. Not a lot of very good options here. You can play Azan, play Trank, you can play QIS, you can play Razor. I think they're all reasonable. Don't really have a strong preference over one over another here. think Azan's probably just slightly better. You're going to need to draw the U if you want to win this game. There's 2 U's in the bag. You need one of them, almost for sure, and preferably a vowel on top of it. It's actually not a very favorable position at all, just because your rack is so clunky. You need some vowels. You need just something good. Regardless of what you play here, you need some pretty good draw to actually bail you out of this situation. It's not a very good situation at all. Even if you play something like Razor and draw the U and draw a vowel, there's no real good options for the Q. Even something like Trank, which is normally terrible, it scores just as many points as Azan, but because the U is so bad and because the R is so powerful here, it's actually a reasonable option here. That being said, I think Azan's probably the best option. Yes, you're going to need to draw well if you want to win the game, but I think that's the play that gives you the best options to actually drawing well and hitting something that can win. Joey, EHNPSTV. So the first thing you want to think about is, what is Jason's range here? And it's probably pretty ugly. Azan doesn't make sense with a lot of different racks. He definitely doesn't have the O, he probably doesn't have the I, pretty unlikely has the S, probably doesn't have the blank either. He might be stuck with something like RR or UU, that's extremely likely as well. But he has to have no better plays than Azan, which is generally pretty ugly. Doesn't score that much, and it also gets rid of duplication, which means that he couldn't have gotten rid of any potential duplication in the pool. So your options are Verts, Pervs, Plash, and Vent. I think you want to discard Vent pretty quickly. SUQ is just really, really dangerous, and most of the time you're not going to be able to do very much afterwards. He's going to even sometimes get to play through the RE, and that's also going to suck for you. And there's just too many options. SUQ and just the Q options are too devastating. After Vent, also just doesn't score that well. Perv's kind of the same thing. You're leaving open the row 1, which is kind of a problem. There's a lot of plays that can go along row 1. And you're also not really killing the divots hook, which means that they can make a 6-tile play at like I3 using the Q, and that's also a big problem. So Verts versus Plash. Plash does leave some Kirsch options or Q-Rush options or other options over there, and that is kind of a problem. But a lot of those plays also play at I3. You do want to keep the E. It's very valuable for you to do so here. The E goes with a lot of the different racks that you can have. It's stuff like Virtu, and just maintains a lot more flexibility. Also manages to block the divots hook, and there's a lot of plays that could be problematic given the divots hook. I think it's pretty close between the two of them. There's a lot of different things that you can go over when it comes to all of these sorts of possibilities. Kirsch does look like a problem, but very likely you're going to have to draw the I or the S anyway. The key tiles here are really the E, the I, the S, and the blank, and you're probably going to need to draw at least 2 of them. Luckily for you, 2 of those tiles are probably in the bag, so it's not going to be as difficult as it might first seem. But yeah, I think that Plash is probably just a better option. Even if he plays Kirsch, you can kind of re-overlap it a lot of the time and you can win that way. And the Virtue hook is really, really valuable to you, and it's going to be really hard to block with a lot of different racks. Kind of confines his play a little bit. There's not really going to be a lot of good Q plays that use the R unless he has QURSH. And you're going to need to draw either the S or the blank anyway, a lot of the time. So given that, I think that Plash does pretty well. But I think that Verts is also very reasonable, and it makes the endgames a lot more difficult, which is something that's really valuable to do, especially in high-pressure situations. You want to make blank plays more difficult. You don't want to make things easy for Jason here. So I think Verts is perfectly fine. I think Plash is perfectly fine, too. It just depends on what types of racks you're trying to chase and go after here. Jason, EOQRRU blank, and quite a few ways to win this game. The easiest play is Rokes, but there's actually 5 different plays that win this game. Jason picks one of them. He plays Air, gives himself Quode to go out next turn, which is almost certainly not going to be blocked. At this point, you're just trying to find something that makes the game, so as soon as you calculate something that you're pretty sure wins, you just generally go for it. I'm guessing that both of them didn't have a ton of time either. Azan probably took quite a bit of time. So yeah, he plays Air, and Joey plays Plash and Quode and wins by 1 point. So that's the game. I think it had a lot of interesting decisions, a lot of very tactical decisions. If you enjoy these, let me know. I'm going to try to focus more on singular plays from now on. I think that it's a lot more interesting for you guys. I don't think that maybe making 20-25 minute videos is that interesting for a lot of people. So I'm going to focus on individual plays at least a lot more from now on. If you have any comments or anything that you'd like me to go over, maybe explain a little bit better, let me know in the comments. And until next time, aloha!